Welcome to the Tobacco Online Policy Seminar, TOPS. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Reggie Hebert, a postdoctoral associate at the Yale School of Public Health. TOPS is organized by Mike Pesco at University of Missouri, C. Shang at The Ohio State University, Michael Darden at Johns Hopkins University, Jamie Hartman Boyce at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Justin White at Boston University. The seminar will be 1 hour with questions from the moderator and discussant. The audience may post questions and comments in the Q&A panel, and the moderator will draw from these questions and comments in conversation with the presenter. Please review the guidelines on tobaccopolicy.org for acceptable questions. Please keep the questions professional and related to the research being discussed. Questions that meet the seminar series guidelines will be shared with the presenter afterwards, even if they're not read aloud. Your questions are very much appreciated. This presentation is being video recorded and will be made available along with presentation slides on the TOPS website, tobaccopolicy.org. I will turn the presentation over to today's moderator, Mike Pesco from the University of Missouri, to introduce our speaker.
Today, we continue our winter 2025 season with a single paper presentation by Davide Dragone entitled Harm Reduction for Addictive Consumption. When does it improve health and when does it backfire? This presentation was selected via a competitive review process by submission through the TOPS website. Dr. Davide Dragone is a professor of economics in the Department of Economics at the University of Bologna, Italy. He is an applied theorist whose research focuses on intertemporal decision-making in health economics, oligopoly theory, and experimental economics. He serves as an associate editor for the Journal of Health Economics and Health Economics. His recent research examines the economics of risky health behaviors, particularly in the areas of substance use, gambling, obesity, and sex work. Dr. Dragone, thank you for presenting for us today.
So thank you very much. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
All right. So thank you very much. Let me share the presentation. And let me see if everything is okay. Is it okay? Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you for hosting me for this presentation of this work, which is joint work with John Cowley from Cornell University. He's also present in the audience. And the goal of this paper is to examine harm reduction method. And we want to study the conditions under which the introduction of this type of methods may help in improving health, or instead it may backfire. So the general idea is that harm reduction strategies imply or have as an idea the idea of switching from a harmful to a less harmful behavior. And specifically in this presentation, I'm going to focus on addictive goods. And for this audience, it's probably convenient to think to an original addictive good as, say, cigarettes, smoking cigarettes, and as a harm reduction method, the possibility of introducing vaping, electronic cigarettes, into the market. About harm reduction, there is the reason why we think this paper may be interesting is that there is a debate about whether this is or not an appropriate strategy. Advocates claim that actually may improve health. Opponents instead are wary of the possibility of moral hazard and eventually initiation, especially among those who would be otherwise abstainers. So you can think to teenagers who were not smoking and that might eventually get lured into trying electronic cigarettes and eventually even becoming dual users and become smokers. What I'm going to present today is a theoretical model. Although I'm aware of the variety of backgrounds of the people participating in this seminar, so we'll try to avoid showing you too many equations. In this paper, we try to show how the introduction of an addictive harm reduction method affects consumption of an original addictive good, specifying the conditions under which one side or instead the other side is correct. Now, the general motivation of why should we care about harm reduction policies, and they say the easy question in a sense is that they imply substantial morbidity and mortality. So the World Health Organization estimates millions of deaths every year because of smoking, because of alcohol use disorder, because of drug overdoses, and because of the human and economic costs associated to this mortality and morbidity. Nations have sought methods to reduce risky health behaviors. One of them is harm reduction. Now, I have to be clear about this. In general, in the debate, when people discuss, they have in mind sometimes different notions of harm reduction. In principle, it can describe many approaches from needle exchange and the supervised injection facilities in the context of substances that need injection. It is a concept that has also been put forward when discussing about condom distribution, or when discussing naloxone access laws, Good Samaritan laws. Even in the context of prostitution, the idea of legalizing prostitution has been sometimes introduced in the debate as a variation within the concept of harm reduction policies. We are going to be very specific instead for what we mean by harm reduction method. We mean two features. One is that it is a substitute for an existing addictive good. We are going to consider addictive substances or addictive consumption, although the case in which there is no addiction involved is just a simple case, a simplified case. This substitute is not just addictive, but it's somehow harmful, or at least it's believed to be harmful, but less harmful than the original addictive good. Again, you can think to cigarettes as the original addictive good, and to electronic cigarettes instead as a substitute, which is still addictive. It is still harmful, although it's believed to be less harmful. And this kind of notion we employ is consistent with, for example, Harm Reduction International, an NGO, which proposes a definition of harm reduction policies as public health policies aimed at decreasing the negative consequences of some behavior without requiring abstinence. So in a sense, this is the exact opposite of the zero tolerance approach, which essentially says if something is bad for you, that should be forbidden. As I said, the effectiveness is controversial. Let's say we have two main polar positions. One, advocates who say, well, actually may reduce health harms, especially it may aid quitting people eventually by helping them to phasing out. Imagine a smoker who now has the availability of an electronic cigarette, which helps the quitting efforts. Instead, the opponents are concerned about moral hazard over two specific type of categories. Those who are already consumers of an addictive good, say smokers, who could become dual consumers, so smokers and vapors, and eventually even reduce their ability to quit. And a second category, probably even more sensitive is the category of previous abstainers. You can imagine teenagers who are not smoking and that instead can initiate the harm reduction method, say vaping, because it's cool or because it's perceived to be less harmful. But because of that, they would become addicted to nicotine and might eventually initiate not just vaping, the harm reduction method, but also the original addictive good. In a sense, this is the worst case scenario. And this ambivalence is present also when we look at the legislation, just focusing, for example, on the US. In 2019, in the US, the minimum age to purchase the electronic cigarettes was raised from 18 to 21. But then after 2 years, the FDA authorized marketing of these cigarettes, and then after just 1 year, the FDA denied marketing of Juul and products. So a sort of ambivalence, which probably can be reconducted also to this difficulty in understanding the boundaries and the cases in which harm reduction method can be dangerous or instead beneficial. And worldwide, we also see that there are countries that have banned the electronic nicotine delivery systems, which can be thought as a form of harm reduction methods, so Australia, Brazil, Cambodia. And in general, we can see a variety of different regulations, from tightly regulated to regulated as if they were pharmaceutical products. So an ambivalence we also see in this type of policies. We see this ambivalence also if we just look at, for example, taxation of electronic cigarettes. In the US, more than 20 states do not tax at all. And when they do state, in other states in which instead they tax electronic cigarettes, the tax rate ranges wildly from 8% to almost 100%. And we see similar kind of ambivalent attitude also for buprenorphine, which is sometimes more regulated than opioid pain relievers. Physicians must take specific trainings, and there are also limitations on the number of patients who can be prescribed by single physician buprenorphine. So because of this ambivalence, we think that the model should somehow also represent this. So what I'm going to show you in the next slides is a model of addictive consumption. We are going to model the demand for harm reduction method, which is not harmful, is not harmless, it's not without addictive properties. It's a harm reduction method that is still addictive and still harmful. And we can show the conditions under which the introduction of this harm reduction method can indeed be beneficial or desirable according to some metrics, or instead on the opposite, could instead be actually could backfire. Specifically, we will focus on what happens to health. We focus on what happens to previous users of the original addictive good, say smokers, and we study what happens when the harm reduction method is introduced into the market. We also consider those who were previously non-users. You may think to teenagers who are not smoking, and we consider the conditions under which they can begin using the harm reduction method and eventually even become smokers after having tried and experimented with the electronic cigarette. We believe this paper and these conditions that we present can contribute to the increasing and growing literature on risk compensation and moral hazard in health behaviors, with specific focus on ends and the growing and large literature by now about ends as substitute for electronic cigarettes, in general economic studies on methadone and buprenorphines or opioids. And we also gave a contribution in terms of the literature on rational addiction, because we merged the model, we model featuring temptation and self-control. Although for this specific presentation, I will not show you the results when augmenting the model in order to allow for self-control and temptation cost. So here comes the model. We consider two goods: C, which is mnemonic for cigarettes, it's the original addictive good, and V, which is mnemonic for vaping, and which we can consider as the harm reduction method. I will consider two scenarios: an original scenario in which only cigarettes are available, and then a second scenario in which also vaping, the electronic cigarette, is available. These two goods, as I said, have addictive properties. And so in the Becker-Murphy rational addiction tradition, we consider the case in which consumption of cigarettes or consumption of vaping increases and builds an addictive stock over time. These goods are also harmful, which means that current smoking and current vaping, but also having vaped in the past or having smoked in the past, increases a health harm. Now, for health economists in the audience, this capital H describes health harm and not the health capital. So this is not the Grossman model. So consumption of these two goods contributes both to being addicted and both to create health harm, with the difference that health harm also depends on past consumption experiences. As an economist, I will introduce a utility function which represents preferences, and which essentially here says that we like, the individual likes smoking and vaping and another composite good, and is also affected by addiction and health harm. Here, the assumptions are relatively intuitive. We assume that consuming is pleasurable. This means that not just an individual as a personal taste likes smoking, but also that maybe there are incentives, say social appreciation, which makes smoking or eventually vaping cool, which means that in general, increasing smoking and increasing vaping is desirable from the perspective of the individual. Additional health harm are bad. This is relatively easy to defend. Probably the most important assumption is this one: reinforcement, which is one of the defining features of the rational addiction model by Becker and Murphy. The idea is that the more I have smoked in the past, so the higher my addiction stock, the more I like smoking today. This is a process of learning through consumption, learning by consuming, which is actually common to other type of processes, and it's one of the defining features of the rational addiction model. Actually, you'll see our results will be derived with respect to the magnitude of this cross derivative, how much past consumption experiences, how much my stock of addiction affects my preferences for vaping today. And this is going to be the key criterion I'm going to use in our propositions. To be fully transparent, we consider closed form solutions because we make a strong assumption about the shape of this utility function. But essentially, let me drive you through, just have a look at the right terms. So the first line of the utility function essentially says desirability, vaping, smoking, and the composite good are something that for me are valuable. They provide positive marginal utility. They feature reinforcement, which means addictiveness. They're also harmful. And the last one is just a technical assumption of concavity. So this is the overall problem. Don't get scared by this. It's just saying I would like to choose optimally my consumption, and if available, also vaping, which could be zero, which could also be zero, taking into account what are the dynamic consequences in terms of building up a stock of addiction, in terms of harming my health over my life cycle. And in a model, I think it's important to have clear what are the trade-offs. One is that smoking and vaping increase addiction and health harm. Increasing addiction further increases the marginal utility of smoking and vaping, which would induce further consumption, addictive consumption. But this addictive consumption is bad. And therefore, the higher the health harm I'm producing to myself, the less I would like to consume. And so this is the type of trade-off that emerges here. So I will now consider, in the following slides, I will consider two scenarios. The first scenario is before the harm reduction method is introduced into the market. Only cigarettes, say, are available. Electronic cigarettes are not legal, do not enter the market, or have not been invented yet. And so we ask who consumes and who doesn't. Then I consider a second scenario in which the electronic cigarette has been introduced into the market, and we want to understand how the users of the addictive good, the smokers, respond, whether they increase or decrease, whether they quit smoking, or whether instead they smoke and vape. How do non-users respond? And probably the question that in the context of harm reduction is more relevant, is overall harm reduced? But probably this is a logical moment to stop a second. If there is some question, I'm very happy to take it.
Okay, thank you, David. I'm
Yes.
going to turn it over to our discussant, Michael Darden, first. Just a brief introduction. Michael Darden, he is an associate professor at the Carey Business School at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you, Michael, for your comments.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, so this is great. Thank you so much, Davide. I mean, this is a really, I think, useful exercise, and it's very helpful for us empirical researchers who want to think about exactly the dynamics at play when we think about something like e-cigarettes and their introduction. My first question is just a kind of a technical question about the utility function. So if I understood correctly, the health stock, excuse me, not the health stock, the health harm term H doesn't affect the marginal utility of either of the goods. Is that correct?
It is.
Yeah.
It
And
is.
so does that rules out the idea that somebody says, smoking is less enjoyable for me because I am, because my health is at a low state, right? So like I think one of the values here is the dynamics, right? It's a dynamic model. And when we think about dynamics, we think that health affects behavior in a way that's important. So can you just talk us through that?
Yes. So thank you for the question. Very precise question. Yes. So here we have reduced the number of interactions. So health harm, say, only directly affects the level of utility. So in a static world, it wouldn't affect the incentives. But in a dynamic world, actually, since it affects the level of utility and also the future profile of intertemporal utility of individual, it would actually introduce a cost. So there is an effect in terms of optimal choice because it affects through the costate variable essentially, and there is also an effect on each level of utility you get over time. So it does so, but it doesn't do it, it wouldn't be so in a static model. You're fully right, but it does so in a dynamic model.
So it does. So it captures the idea that like I'm concerned about my health, and so I'm going to switch to
Exactly.
cigarettes, but it doesn't account for the fact that like smoking is literally just less pleasurable now because.
You're right.
Okay.
You're right.
Okay. That's helpful. So then, and in terms of the goals of the model, so I think you're going to give us some conditions in which the introduction of an alternative technology is good for health or bad for health. I'm a little bit surprised that you haven't instead asked the question, how harmful in a relative sense is the new technology? How harmful would it need to be for this to be utility maximizing in some way? Because there's considerable uncertainty in the scientific literature about the relative harms of e-cigarettes compared to cigarettes. Alcott and Rafkin have that survey in their paper where they find that the physicians are all over the map, right? That people don't know. So it seems like that's something that could be useful that your model could produce is kind of like, if e-cigarettes are only 5% as harmful as traditional cigarettes, then I guess that would be in your harm reduction function. But can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, no, thank you. Also, this one is a very good question. So yes, so in the model, I actually skip this very, very, very quickly. So here we assume that so here everything is based on the individual perception, the individual beliefs of how harmful a good is and how much it contributes to addiction and health harm. So it's really individual beliefs. If they're wrong, then the decisions are correct with respect to the belief, but the belief is wrong. And so here I didn't mention it explicitly. For example, here we assume that the contribution of vaping to the health harm is positive, so it's not innocuous, and we can think in general it makes sense to debate about harm reduction policies in the case in which this epsilon h, the contribution to harm, is less than 1. So less than the contribution to smoking. But you're fully right, especially in the case of vaping, actually, in which one can eventually tweak a little bit the vapor. Then eventually this can even be larger than 1. So the model allows for this possibility that this is even riskier or perceived to be riskier in terms of health and contribution to health. And I suspect that actually the results I'm going to show you could be delivered in terms of this perceived epsilon h, this perceived contribution to health harm. But I suspect the conclusion would be similar, but I don't have I don't have the
No,
results exactly to show.
I think it would just be helpful for the empirical folks to kind of think about
Yes,
you're right, because if that epsilon there is 0, then it doesn't matter, and if it's
of course.
I don't think it's probably not the case that epsilon is greater than 1 in the context of e-cigarettes. So, but it's somewhere between 0 and 1, and any information, any thresholds that we can get out of a model like this would be helpful for us.
Yeah.
But I'll turn over to Mike, and maybe he has some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Michael. And please continue to add your questions to the Q&A if you have any. So there's 2 questions there currently. First is missing solid scientific evidence for the claim that vaping is as addictive as smoking. Is the underlying assumption correct? Is nicotine really the only relevant factor for the addiction? You're muted.
You're on.
Okay. So no, this is a simplifying assumption. We just assume that vaping and smoking contributes to some addiction stock, which is likely to be nicotine, but probably not just nicotine. And yes, it's just a simplifying assumption in that respect. So
Right.
yeah.
And then kind of mostly an observation, a comment, but I guess you could provide your reactions to it. The reinforcement theory seems to be falsified by empirical data. Most smokers do indeed increase their consumption in the beginning, but most reach an individual plateau where they stay. Any reactions to that?
Yes, no, thank you for the question. That's exactly the intuition one would have about reinforcement. This idea that the more I smoke, the more I like smoking, the more I like smoking, the more I smoke, and this would become explosive. This is a possibility, but it's not the solution of the model. The solution of the model is that as I get more and more addicted, I consume more and more, but I do reach a plateau. I will show you in the next slides. So actually, the long run equilibrium, the stationary equilibrium, in which the smoker smokes regularly a fixed amount of, say, a fixed number of cigarettes. So it might produce explosive trajectories, but we are not focusing on these type of trajectories, also because they couldn't be estimated, they wouldn't be stationary. We focus on stationary trajectories, which can be treated also from an econometric point of view.
Okay. Another question here in the Q&A. What is the basis for the claim that the value of harm from vaping would be less than for smoking, given the conflicting evidence mentioned?
There's not much evidence. So the assumptions I showed here about the relative contribution of vaping with respect to smoking to health harm and to consumption, here it's more because of intuition that we think is less addictive and less harmful than smoking, and because this is the general perception, but I have no hard evidence this is in fact the case. I must say, however, that even if we do not impose the assumption that epsilon A, so the contribution of vaping to the stiction stock is smaller, and even if we do not impose this assumption that the contribution of vaping to health harm is less than smoking, the model still holds. These are just for, I think, building the intuition for what we have in mind, but they're not technically needed.
Okay. Great. That clears the Q&A. So go ahead and proceed with your presentation. Audience members can feel free to keep adding to the Q&A as we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Excellent. All right. So after the presentation of the model and what I want to do, consider a scenario before and a scenario after. Let me go for the results directly. So we are in the before results. So only smoking is available. I showed you the model. We solved the model, and the model turns out that has a very, very nice solution, which we think could be also amenable to empirical estimation. This is an optimal consumption path. It's a policy function, what macroeconomists would call a policy function, which says how much consumption is optimal given a certain stock of addiction and health at some point in time. So if you have some measure of health harm, say the health condition of individual, and you have some measure of the addiction stock, say how much the past history of smoking cigarettes, this could be estimated. This intercept is actually a function of the long run consumption level, but most importantly, it's also a negative function of prices, which means that cigarettes, even if addictive, follow the low demand, which is reassuring. It's the typical theoretical prediction of the rational addiction model. It's also the theoretical basis for all tax-based policies aimed at deterring consumption of cigarettes, essentially. Now, the interesting thing is that this function looks like a linear function. It is a linear function, but it can produce oscillatory consumption, oscillatory smoking in the medium term. So let me provide this animation. Imagine a person here. So in blue, we have smoking of cigarettes. So imagine a person that is a no smoker initially, so no addiction to nicotine and no smoking, that over time, for some reason, because my friends say I'm cool or any other reason, starts smoking over time. As this person starts smoking over time, the addiction stock increases, the health harm increases, and here the trade-off between the two kicks in at some point, because at some point I will reverse smoking. I will decrease my smoking levels, but I'm still smoking too much in such a way that my addiction stock increases and my health harm increases even more. And because of that, I reduce my smoking over time until at some point I hit some minimum level. And then I say, well, actually, my health harm has been reducing in the last periods, and also my addiction to nicotine, I can revert back to smoking. And as I was mentioning before, although the model has this reinforcement property, in the long run, consumption is going to be stationary eventually after some oscillatory experimentation, let's say periods in which you smoke more and then you smoke less, and then in the long run, you get to some stationary level. Now, the question is, what are the drivers of these stationary levels? And this is the expression for the long run consumption level divided into three terms. And essentially, the idea is the more I like, the more I find desirable, the more I get approval by my peers for smoking, the more is likely I'm going to smoke in the long run, and this level is positive. The higher the price, the lower the likelihood I'm going to be a smoker in the long run. And then this third term is actually the perceived disutility of addiction and health harm. So depending on how much I like it, how much it costs in monetary terms, and how much it costs in terms of disutility, this is going to determine whether in the long run I'm going to be a smoker or not. And so these are the possible drivers. So what makes unconditionally more desirable to smoke, say social appreciation or lack of stigma? What can increase and affect the price of smoking? Well, it's monetary price, but eventually taxes or subsidies, no, in case we are talking about a good which we want to subsidize. And what can affect in this utility of addiction and health harm? Well, for example, awareness about health harm, education. So these type of factors do affect my behavior, and in the long run, I will be a smoker if the sum of these three terms is positive, the algebraic sum. Then, now that we know who's going to be a smoker and who's not going to be a smoker, let's consider the case in which there's the possibility of introducing a harm reduction method. As before, who's going to be a vapor in the long run? So ignore this term for the moment. Those who are going to be vapor, where D here stands for dual consumption, are those who value vaping, who have for some reason appreciation for their peers, so they like it. So these are the same terms I just showed you in the previous slide. So vapors are those who give value to vaping, for which the price of vaping is not too high and the disutility of addiction and health harm is not too large. So in a sense, the main drivers are the same. Vaping is more likely if I like vaping a lot. Net of its cost and utility cost. And what if I was already a smoker? Now this term zeta is positive, which means that if I was a smoker or eventually a heavy smoker yesterday, today, in which vaping is possible, is more likely that I'm going to be a vapor. So previous smokers are more likely to be vapors than previous abstainers. So overall, the question about should we allow a harm reduction method on the market? It ultimately depends on its effect, the effect of the availability of V on C, that is smoking, and health harm. And it turns out that all our results can be categorized in three cases, depending on the intensity of the addictiveness of the harm reduction method. So the intensity of this reinforcement term, which, let me just repeat, is how much the stock of addiction I have affects my marginal utility for vaping. And we can distinguish three cases in which reinforcement is below a threshold R low. In this case, we say reinforcement is mild, reinforcement is moderate, reinforcement or addictiveness is high when instead it's above a certain threshold. And that we will provide our results with respect to these three possible cases. So let me first consider the case about consumption. We want to compare the case in which the case of the smoking level I had in the previous scenario when only smoking was available, and we want to compare it with the new regime in which now also vaping is available. Let me recall this D stands for dual consumption because in the second period both smoking and vaping are available. We are interested in this delta. If it is positive, it means that the person will smoke more after the introduction of the harm reduction method. If it is negative, it means that the person will smoke less. It turns out that this delta depends on essentially two terms. One is whether or not I'm going to be a vapor. Because if I'm not going to be a vapor, so this is zero, actually in the long run, there won't be any difference for a smoker. And this is kind of intuitive. If I'm not going to pick up vaping as a habit, I will just behave as I used to behave when vaping was not available. However, if I start to be a vapor, and I showed you before the conditions under which a person becomes a vapor. So if I become a vapor, my response in terms of smoking behavior depends on the intensity of reinforcement, depending on my personal tastes, with respect to this threshold. So case number one, if vaping is very addictive, which means that this term is positive, it means that after vaping, after taking up vaping as a behavior, I will also increase my smoking behavior. If I was already a smoker, I now smoke and vape, dual consumption, bad scenario. We don't generally like it. If instead the person was an abstainer, because of vaping and because vaping is very addictive, then this person is likely to initiate and to increase smoking. Before the smoking level was zero, after the introduction of the vaping opportunity and taking up a vaping, the person starts also to smoke. Case number two, vaping is not highly addictive, which means this term is negative, and therefore after taking up vaping, the person will actually reduce smoking. So if the person was already a smoker, we would observe actually a substitution between vaping and smoking, more vaping and less smoking. If instead the person was an abstainer, okay, the person will start vaping, but will not also initiate smoking. Okay, so we have these two possibilities. For what concerns smoking as a potential outcome, we are interested. But and this, for example, this criterion about the addictiveness might explain, for example, why methadone is typically dispensed in clinics because it's believed to be sufficiently addictive, and the legislators do not trust patients to have a big supply at home, and instead in other cases buprenorphine, for example, for opioids, which is widely seen as safer, is typically allowed to be taken home because it shouldn't create problems of dual consumption. Now, what happens instead in terms of health? Because after all, we are talking about harm reduction policies, and this may be the relevant target, health. So as before, we can manipulate our expressions until we get to this very nice and very compact expression, the difference in health harm, comparing the new scenario and the old scenario. It depends, as before, on whether or not I pick up vaping. If I don't pick up vaping, nothing happens in the long run. I don't vape, so nothing changes in terms of health with respect to the previous scenario. But if I start vaping, then the answer depends on the intensity of the reinforcement of vaping or the addictiveness of vaping with respect to this low reinforcement threshold. And so, again, we have two cases. If the vaping is moderately or highly addictive, then this term is going to be positive, and therefore after vaping, my health harm will get worse. If instead it's mildly addictive, this term is going to be negative, and the health harm will actually decrease. So let me put everything together. This is the slide that sums up all our results. We have two results, essentially, one in terms of what happens in terms of smoking and what happens in terms of health harm after the introduction of a harm reduction method. And so here we see three cases, when in the case in which addictiveness is mild, moderate, or high. So suppose people start with the new harm reduction method. They start vaping. Let's say if the addictiveness is high, I start vaping, but I also increase my smoking. Overall health harm increases. This is clearly a case in which the introduction of a harm reduction method backfires. So those who are against it might be right. Under the condition, the harm reduction method is very highly addictive. However, in the opposite case, in which the harm reduction method is mildly addictive, it turns out that the person starts vaping, but would actually reduce smoking so much would be the reduction that the health harm also will ultimately decrease. So in this case, we would have a person that reduces smoking, but increases vaping, and overall the health harm is decreased. In this case, clearly the harm reduction method is a success. And then we have an intermediate case in which actually there is some substitution between vaping and smoking, so more vaping and less smoking, but that reduction in smoking is not enough, and the health harm ultimately increases. So you see there is a certain variety of nuances. If instead the harm reduction method is not considered, then nothing happens because the harm reduction method is essentially irrelevant, and therefore smoking and health harm would remain unchanged. So this allows me to go to the conclusion. I have showed you in these slides, in this presentation, that the introduction of harm reduction method may have different effects. First of all, it may be not desirable enough. If it's not desirable enough, for example, because flavored electronic cigarettes are not available anymore, then people would just not use it. So in this case, if the harm reduction method is not desirable, it's not good because we don't observe any decrease in, say, smoking, but it's also not bad because there is no change in the health harm or in the addiction stock. If it is desirable, however, and people decide to use it, then current users are more likely to use. So previous smokers are more likely to be vapers than abstainers. And then I also mentioned some of the variables that may affect this initiation choice and choice of vaping, like social appreciation, stigma, prices and taxes, to speak of monetary incentives, awareness about health harms. And so this is kind of relatively known from the anti-smoking, the literature on anti-smoking policy, which have exactly tried to address these specific elements. And then I showed you three cases, which we can sum up in the following way. If people start with the harm reduction method, but the harm reduction method is mildly addictive, then the advocates of the introduction of the harm reduction method are right, because indeed, because of people who start vaping, then they will also reduce smoking and their health harm will be reduced. If instead it is highly addictive, the opposite occurs. Vaping and smoking become complements. And so people who start vaping also become smokers or even harder smokers. So in that case, harm reduction method would backfire. And then I showed you also an intermediate case, which occurs when the harm reduction method is moderately addictive, in which we observe, in fact, less consumption, say less smoking, but overall there is more health harm. So depending on your objective function, whether you are more concerned about smoking as a behavior, or instead you're more concerned on health harm as an outcome in terms of health, then you may get different, you may like or not case number 3. And with this, I conclude, and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn it over to our discussant, and as usual, please continue to add questions to the Q&A.
Great paper. It was really interesting, and I appreciate all the work that you did in laying out the different cases. I think that's super helpful. I want to ask one question relative to the literature that you've probably gotten, and I just would help my own thinking on this. Can you clarify the ways in which your model and your predictions and your results are different from those from the Alcott and Rafkin paper? In that model, they had a discrete time model in which they were thinking about utility maximization. And clearly their efforts were to try to get down to some sufficient statistics where they could think about the welfare implications of e-cigarettes. And they really emphasize the cross-price elasticity of substitution between e-cigarettes and cigarettes, the price elasticities of each respective good, and the relative health harms. And your model comes in and says, what really matters here is the relative addictiveness, or how addictive, the absolute addictiveness of the harm reduction method. So can you help me think about the differences between the two papers, and where we should go from here?
Yeah. So no, thank you for the question. So the way I showed you the results, everything is framed in terms of addictiveness and these three categories. But alternatively, and also we also framed as the harm reduction method introduced or not into the market. You can think to this in an alternative way, like the price. So suppose both goods were available always, but for some reason in the previous period, the price of the electronic cigarette is very, very high, and then it's reduced. So in a sense, we consider a case in which from an infinite price of electronic cigarette, it becomes a feasible price which people can afford. Because of that, actually, we show in the paper that our results, which depends on these three thresholds, are the same results you would obtain in terms of cross elasticity. In other words, sorry, took me some time. We could obtain cross elasticity, which is positive or negative, on, say, behavior, say smoking, depending on the sign of this addictiveness term. So by changing the addictiveness term, that would change the cross price elasticity of that paper.
Okay.
With respect to that, we add one of the key variable that is this reinforcement property, and we also focus on health harm, which depends again on this reinforcement feature.
Great. That's great. That's helpful. Thank you. One thing I want to ask about that you didn't really talk about in the presentation, you alluded to, but is prominent in the paper, is the behavioral some of the behavioral economics, some of the deviations from a rational model. And specifically, you focus on the kind of Gall and Pessendorfer literature on dual self and temptation. And I'm wondering why you focused on that particular behavioral deviation from rationality, when instead, again, thinking about Alcott and Rafkin, they think about just a pure time inconsistency problem in which someone is unable to plans to quit but is unable to quit smoking cigarettes. Your focus is instead on this dual self temptation framework, and I wonder what the differences in terms of policy implications are between those two frameworks when we have this harm reduction method.
Yeah, thank you. So in general, when we talk about policy interventions as economists, we always want to justify this intervention on the basis of some market failure or eventual internality or self-control cost. And this is typically this harm reduction debate is a typical case in which there is a policy intervention. So we wanted to. So where was the market failure? This was exactly what the discussion I had with John Coley, and we said, well, where is the market failure? And there is no market failure in the model as the model I showed you, because the individual is perfectly able to understand costs and benefits of smoking and vaping in the long run, takes them into account, and behaves optimally. But we felt like there was a missing ingredient, and that's why we went for the temptation and self-control cost, which allows to take into account this conflict between what people that want to smoke and people that can't quit, for example. We didn't model explicitly time inconsistent behavior because, in a sense, that is a second step. So I think conceptually, it's better to have the benchmark, the first best, in a sense. So what would be the best ideal behavior? And then when you want to focus on whether people are able to implement that first best behavior, then it's a good idea to introduce time inconsistency as a second step. As a second step.
So, okay, I think I understand that. But that kind of so that tees up my last question, which is I think of the rational addiction framework or any of these frameworks as explaining the dynamics of people who have a positive stock of addictive capital already, and they do a good job of that. The models don't do a good job historically of thinking about the initiation of these products. So if I'm a young person and I'm fully rational, according to the model, I should be able to forecast the fact that this addictive path of consumption is going to lead me to lower levels of utility relative to a counterfactual in which I have no nicotine consumption at all. And so I wonder, when we think about the world in which now there's not just one addictive product, but two, I mean, what assumptions are needed here? So we're assuming that people fully understand the addictiveness of each of these goods. Why are people starting in this case? Because I asked that from kind of a policy perspective too, because the trade-off here is that we want potentially to get smokers to switch, but we don't want to have young people start e-cigarettes, and that's what we're seeing in the US at least, is huge numbers of young people getting addicted to nicotine through e-cigarettes. So, does can your model help us think about that?
Yes and no. So let's say you're fully right that the rational addiction model explains why people keep on consuming an addictive good more than why do they start, and for that there were not or other models that were like, because they don't know how much addictive it is, for example, or find it there was. Actually, for example, the picture I showed, it was a picture in which the addiction stock was zero. And the initial consumption was zero, but then exactly because of the incentives, people start consuming. I'm not sure, however, that in the long run, the profile of a person that starts smoking, although is harming their health, I'm not sure this is the level of utility is going to be higher than
I think it's going to be lower.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's going to be lower. I'm not sure it's going to be lower. You have to take into account also that they wouldn't do that actually. They wouldn't start if the overall profile, the overall discounted profile were lower. No, you're fully right.
I mean, I think that's the flavor of the question, right? So like, I mean, it needs some exogenous shock to get a positive stock to get them going, right? Something.
That's the usual. That's the Becker-Murphy explanation. Or something happens, a divorce or a shock, and therefore for some reason I start. In our model, it's just that it's convenient. It's even with the zero stock, because you take into account the future consequences. This is just a good idea to start.
I see John has a comment in the chat. It says people initiate when they perceive the marginal utility of consumption is greater than the sum of all of the pecuniary costs and their perception of the long run non-pecuniary costs, which include future health harms and future higher addictive stock. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I think what's interesting here too is that, in most of economics, we think of innovation as being utility and improving, right? And so here we have a innovation that the kind of utility implications are mixed depending on its features and the behavioral responses.
Even more, actually, exactly, even more, because what we explicitly acknowledge is that actually policymakers may have, also in the debate, people may have different objectives. You may just be interested in teenager smoking, or in smoking behavior per se, or in health harm, or in utility. In terms of utility, this is all, well, except for the case that the self-control, extension, But without temptation and self-control, this is all welfare improving.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just health worsening in some cases, so it makes people smoke more. So just considering single parts, single ingredients of our utility function.
So we have a few outstanding questions, so we probably should try to cover these quickly. Thanks for a great discussion. One of the questions here in the chat from one of the TOPS administrators is many countries and some US states have introduced limits on nicotine concentration in vape liquid. Does your model predict that this would reduce addiction stock and lower consumption of both the harm reduction method and the original harmful good?
It should. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, short answer.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to combine two. Oh, I see John's responding to one of Ken Warner's questions now, but I'll try to collapse them here. So Ken says the rational addiction models largely ignore the rationality of becoming addicted. Becoming addicted is rarely, if ever, rational in the sense that beginning smokers or vapors do not understand addiction if you believe that they will become addicted. Please explain how you incorporate this in your model. Incorporate in your model the irrationality of becoming addicted. And he also then added, also considering the addiction versus harm utility factors, there are studies reporting that laboratory mice addicted to certain drugs will choose those drugs over food and water repeatedly. They will literally starve themselves to death. Please explain how you would incorporate such irrational behavior into a rational addiction model.
So the term, yeah, I should have been very clear. So the term rational is not the term rational we use in normal discourse. So the term rational in the rational addiction model means it's a technical concept, which just means that people exactly know what they want to do and they behave as they planned. It has nothing to do with being smart or being clever or being far-sighted. So in general, when we talk about people doing irrational things, it's like doing stupid things. In this specific case, rationality is not about people being smart. It's just people making a plan which they believe is the optimal plan and being able to implement it. So it's a technical definition. I think it's a marketing, probably marketing mistake or probably marketing genius idea to call it a model of rational addiction. It's a model of addiction in which people learn over time how to affect their preferences in a sense. So it's a more, what I'm saying is that it's a linguistic definitional problem. It has nothing to do with being smart.
Okay. And I have one of my own questions. So I'm assuming that the harm reduction method, it depends on people preferring the original addictive good more than the harm reduction method. Is that accurate?
It's not necessary. It's not strictly necessary. It's just people that were smoking before or using the original addictive good, and then the other good becomes available or less expensive.
Right. So I mean, I guess how should we think about? I think that, like I typically think of harm reduction at least as like, okay, there's some product that provides less utility to users, right? But that's safer, right? And so people, they make like a trade-off, between, I want to consume the original substance because I like it more, but this other product is safer, so I'm going to use that, right? And e-cigarettes in some ways I feel is kind of unusual because I think there's a lot of people, like there's a lot of accidental quitters, people that didn't even mean to quit smoking and they picked up an e-cigarette and tried it one day and suddenly they decided that they just preferred the e-cigarette, right? And obviously it doesn't have some of the some of the odors that smoking have and other things like that aren't necessarily health, but that might affect desirability of using one product or the other. So should we be thinking of e-cigarettes as a harm reduction, or is there kind of a case to be made that e-cigarettes aren't necessarily a harm reduction product and they're just kind of like a product that some consumers at least might just prefer, even regardless of the health implications, they might just have a stronger preference for it? one or the other?
I think it's a fair comment. So in principle, the two goods may have different marginal utilities. So vaping can be, so the harm reduction method can be, yes, worse quality in a sense. Or but could also be more appreciated, more desirable, and that wouldn't change the results. On vaping, the way we think to vaping in the context of this paper is that it can be a harm reduction method. It's actually the way we think this. And we were interested in the conditions under which smoking and vaping are substitutes and complements. And we are actually kind of happy that we could reconduct these differences to the intensity of how much addictive is vaping.
All right. Well, thanks so much for a great presentation. In a thoughtful discussion. I'm going to turn it over to our MC to take us out the door.
Thank you very much.
We are out of time. Thank you to our presenter, moderator, and discussant. And finally, thank you to the audience of 181 people for your participation. Have a top-notch weekend.